The only person I interacted with really was Scott Adams, and Scott and I amazingly didn't talk too much. The one thing I do remember about Scott Adams was that when my wife and I celebrated, I think it was our first anniversary, he sent us a very nice fruit basket from Harry and David. And I remember the pineapple in that fruit basket was so sweet and juicy. But beyond that, I have very little recollections of talking with Scott Adams. I talked with somebody who worked under him as an administrative assistant, and that relationship did not go well. When we were having problems with the copyrights to Star Trek and Paramount Pictures, I repeatedly told Scott through his administrator, do not use them. We haven't got the rights secured, and somehow that message never got through to Scott. Ultimately, he was sued by Star Trek and Paramount Pictures, and that hurt his business, but it ended our relationship, and financially, without that income, it was only a matter of time before I would fail. In hindsight, I don't regret doing what I did. If I had a little more business sense, there were opportunities for me to sell the business, and I would have sold it. But I didn't have that kind of business sense then. My training was as an electrical engineer, not as a business major, which is one thing if I had to do over again I would have done. I would have gotten my degree as a business major. I'm trying to remember the size of the royalty checks we got from Adventure, but I seem to remember a number of around maybe $100 a month, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, depending on the season of the year. From the sale of the communication programs, we were getting a few $100s a month as well. So we had a nice tidy income coming in from that. And then there were some sales that we generated directly, either from people calling us on our 800 number, which was a new thing then, or making the sale directly one way or another. But that was where all of our income went. And when the other businesses external to us dried up, our income dropped to 1/3. In '83, it was 1/3 of what it was in '82, yet we had expanded out to be able to do more and increased our size by 50%. So you can see the way the plan was formulated and the way it played out was a formula for disaster. So we'll take, for example, the cheeseburger. Okay, what can you do with a cheeseburger? Well, you could talk to a cheeseburger, but it wouldn't do anything. You could listen to a cheeseburger and it wouldn't do anything. You could pick up a cheeseburger and now you have it in your possession. You could put it down if you have it in your possession. And of course, you could eat the cheeseburger, or you could feed the cheeseburger to a hungry dog or robot or whatever. So the cheeseburger has properties of things that you can do with it, or things that it doesn't know how to do, and then as the character manipulates the object, it enables or disables those particular properties. That, I think, is more than anything else what is unique about Dogstar is the way it approached the problem of handling the properties. There are a couple of things that I would like people to know. One of the things is that over the years, the thing that hurt me the most personally was that people thought I was a millionaire. They did then, and even to this day, there are people who think I have millions and millions of dollars. So let me set that rumor to rest. In 1982, which was my best year, my gross before paying taxes was only $16,000. And I didn't make anywhere near as much money as $16,000 for many years after that. I was not a millionaire. I wasn't even close to being a millionaire. And most of the people who bought the products that I had were making more money than I was. In 1975, I was working on a project for Vermont Educational Television, and I had use of the computer facilities at the University of Vermont. Most of the students down there were working on their projects, but there were some students who were using it for gaming or leisure activity. And I was watching this game they were playing, and it was very fascinating to me. I never saw anything like this before, where they were typing in these verbal commands, and the computer was responding as if it was a character in a fantasy world. So I found out the name of the game was called Adventure, and I sat down at one of the unused terminals and typed Advent to get into the game, and then began to explore this very interesting world. Now, I remember in the beginning of the game, you were out on a grassy knoll. It was one of the words it used, and you had to go south and east, and you eventually got to a grate, and then from there you went down to the entrance of a cave. You couldn't go into the cave as you were because it was dark inside. I tried it once, and you tripped and fell. But at the entrance of the cave, there was a light, and the secret to getting started was to type the command, get lamp. And then the computer picked up the lamp, turned on the light, and the adventure began. The Dogstar Adventure came out after Star Wars, and I think if you look at Star Wars and Dogstar Adventure, you can see some of the influence of that. You have a princess, you have a Death Star, but also the influence of the original adventure game that came out in the 70s played into that as well. Now, one of the things that I had learned before writing Dogstar was how to use arrays. And Dogstar was written on the TRS-80 Model 1, which with the original Level 1 Basic in it only had one array, the A array, which you could get out to like 40, 50, 100 array length, but only one dimension. So you had to be very clever as to how you use that array. When I wrote Star Trek 3, I had to use the array as a three-dimensional array. The reason it was called Star Trek 3 was because it used a three-dimensional galaxy. It had nothing to do with the movie Star Trek 3. And then taking that, that technique, I began to apply it to some other fun items. And one of them was the idea of just writing a variation of the big adventure game that I had played at the University of Vermont. The problem was that that big adventure game was only for big computers, and we had this little TRS-80 Model 1 with 16K of memory and a very limited basic. So there was a challenge there to create a game that gave you the feel of adventure without all of the resources it took to actually play this big version of the game. And based on that, I just played around with it and eventually came up with the game that was called Dogstar. I don't even remember why we ended up calling it Dogstar, but someone suggested the name and it kind of stuck, and that's how it ended up getting the name. There are some influences from the TRS-80 Model 1 in the game. At one point, you come to a computer terminal and you have to type the command cload, which is a command from the TRS-80 Level 1 computer to load a program you've stored on cassette tape into the computer. You also need the element of what's known in storytelling, a time bomb. You need something that's going to happen, and if you don't move quickly enough through the game, then the chances of winning are reduced, or maybe you can't win at all. So I incorporated into the game the cheeseburger. First, you had to find the cheeseburger in order to get rid of the guard robot, and you had to move quickly enough that the cheeseburger didn't get cold. And the cheeseburger was my time bomb. There was also the element of a maze, and in the original adventure game from the 1970s, there were mazes to go through. Well, to get to the dungeon where the princess was located, you had to go through a series of mazes, and I incorporated that into the game. There's a little bit of another game that I wrote called Treasure Hunt, which was basically a variation of Hunt the Wumpus, in which you had this big cave connected by various little tunnels, and you needed to use a map to play this effectively. But with each room you went into, the computer would tell you if it heard something or didn't hear something. And then you had to use logic to figure out if the thing you wanted was a dragon or something you didn't want to get near in the next room, or if it was a place you felt safe going. And there's a little bit of that I incorporated into the Dogstar game as well. And all of these things kind of came together at a time when game writing was a popular thing, thanks to the TRS-80 Software Exchange, which published all of these games that I wrote and many more. I did this originally just for fun. Never occurred to me to do this as a business. and it never occurred to me there'd be any fame involved in this. It was just a fun thing to do, and I did it for fun. The TRS-80 Software Exchange offered a way to go and market it, but I don't like the word market, because when you deal with creative people, and I'm going to use the example of a photographer. A photographer goes and he sees a beautiful sunset, and he takes a picture of that. And he goes and he makes a 16 by 20 print of it and frames it and so on. If someone goes and buys that picture, it's a very high honor that he can share the beauty and the thing that he created with someone else. There may not be a money or business motive to it, but it's a matter of feeling that you've shared something beautiful with other people and they've liked it enough to go and buy it. And that was the kick for me. It was never money motivated. I got very little feedback from people about the game, and the reason is that at that time, if you sold maybe 100 copies of a computer program, that was considered pretty good. Today, people would laugh at that amount. You can sell 100 copies of a computer program in an hour on the internet today, and it still might not be a successful program. There are two similarities between the game Treasure Hunt, which is cave exploring, and the Star Trek III game. And that is that it required strategy. It was a thinking man's game. There was no interaction in real time like you get with a lot of today's arcade games, where there's not enough time to think. You have to react with gut instincts. So the challenge with game writing then was to create a good strategy game, a thinking man's game. No doubt this is the reason why chess has been so popular with computer programs going back to the 1950s. It's a thinking man's game, and for many years in the beginning of computers, there were no graphics that people had to work with. So you had to appeal to their sense of overcoming the odds and figuring things out. And I think the reason people like mysteries is because they like the challenge of figuring things out. And that was something I wanted to incorporate into all of the games, and that included Dog Star Adventure. The historic role of Dog Star Adventure surprised me, because I actually had forgotten about the game for a couple of decades. And people began to approach me several years ago from my website and asked me for permission to republish the game, which I was very liberal at giving. I forgot about it, and I didn't think anybody really cared about it. A couple of years ago, I did a dangerous thing, and I Googled myself, as they say, and a lot of the hits that I got were things I expected. But I began to see Dog Star coming up, and I clicked on one of the links where someone was talking about the history of adventure gaming and gaming, and I was amazed at the credit that I got. I remember telling my wife, you know, I had no idea I did this, and I didn't. I wrote Dog Star for fun. It was available through the TRS-80 Software Exchange on cassette, and they bought the rights to publish the game because it was a magazine, and they needed computer games to publish in order to have a subscription to a magazine to sell. And that's what it was all about. It was never about creating a whole new genre of games or a whole new way of writing them. And it was simple as that, and I went on with my life. At that time, for the TRS-80s, the distribution was on cassette tape or publishing the source code. And it was possible at that time to publish source code, and people could type it in. The cassette tape just allowed you to save the time of typing it all in and playing the game. I found myself that sometimes, if it wasn't a big program, typing it in was kind of an extra kick, because you're typing this thing in, you don't know exactly what it's going to do when it's done, and it was like the thrill of opening the surprise box. As you get closer and closer to finishing it, maybe you type run just to see how the introduction looks, and it's like, wow, you know, I can't wait till I finish this, and so on. Then you debug it a little for the typos that made it in, and then you get the thing running. But I had said to myself long ago that someday I got to get me one of these things, and then I'm going to do some great stuff with it. And the someday came, and I did. I think the success of a computer game is like the success of a book or a movie Adventure games are really storytelling, but they differ in that you can control the telling of the story. Let me explain it this way. When you write a traditional story, you start with a plot, and the plot is a path that goes from the beginning of the story to the end of the story. The characters are what the story is about, how the characters, what happened to them when they went down that path. Now, if you go and you read a book, you have a plot, you have characters, they go down the path and they reach the end, and maybe you're happy with the outcome, maybe you're not. The same thing would be true of movies. You have a plot, you have characters, and the characters react, they follow the path, and they reach the end. Now along comes the computer with its interactive novel, and now you have a different kind of plot, because just like the book story, you have a plot and it could go in many directions, but you have no choice. This is the direction the story goes. With the interactive novel, the plot has many directions, and you can decide which one you want to go to get to the end. So it now becomes like a maze. You come into a maze, and there's many turns that you can make, and a lot of them will lead to the wrong place you want to go. But ultimately, there is a path that will get you to the exit. And the interactive novel, the plot is like a maze. Whereas in a real story, you have an entrance and you have an exit and you have twists and turns, but there's no opportunity to explore. I think people like the idea of dealing with the maze. They like the challenge of that. They like exploring. They like learning. They like playing roles, doing things that they couldn't normally do, being people they normally could never be, even good or bad, wouldn't matter. As the writer, you have to understand that's what your audience wants. And you've got to give your audience that kind of material to work with. Give them the maze with the multiple paths. Give them the characters to explore the maze. And give them an objective to go to. And let them feel the challenge and enjoy playing the role. From the time I wrote Dog Star Adventure until the decades after, I got almost no feedback from it at all. I don't even remember the game fondly. It's something I did. It was fun to do. I played it a little and I moved on, and I really kind of almost forgotten about it. The feedback I got from people more recently, we'll say several years since now, has been that they remembered it, and it brought me joy to know that this brought them a sense of joy in their life back then, and they enjoyed playing it again. And that meant something to me, meant a lot to me. I get my thrill is bringing joy to people, doing something to benefit their life. And to that degree, yes. But as far as being contacted with that program, no. And frankly, it was printed in a magazine. Anyone could go and type it in. So the feeling of, well, somebody stole it from me wasn't there with Dog Star. I made the decision in 1979 to start my own company. There were a couple of reasons for it, and one of it was that at the time, the place where I worked, there were a lot of disagreements with management, and I didn't know how well the future would hold out there. And at that point in time, things in the computer business were on the rise, and it looked to me like an opportunity to get in on the ground floor and ride the rise. There were a lot of things I wanted to do, but I didn't have the time to do them. So all these things kind of came together, and I decided that I would start my own software company and grow it. My wife worked at the University of Vermont, and so we had her income as a good backstop until we could get it off the ground. And the first year was very hard running my own company, as it is for most people. I had to work 60, 70 hours a week, and there were times when it just seemed as if it would never go anywhere. But it finally did fairly well in 81 and did extremely well in 82 for what it was. And then in 83, the bottom dropped out of everything. And the businesses that started out in the late 70s just shriveled up and died. TRS-80 Softside died in 84. We died at the end of 83. Scott Adams eventually got out of it. In fact, the only survivor was Microsoft. and their success is legendary. The rest of us never made it. There was a signal, it was a very clear signal to get out. The money was not coming in, and the bill collectors were there, and there was a very sad day in July of '83 when I had to tell my small staff that I couldn't even pay them anymore. I did eventually pay them. I made sure they were very good to me, but there was no way to keep it running, and I'd eventually wind it down and file for bankruptcy, which was in mid-November of '83. And those were very sad and very, very hard times. What made it even more difficult was that I was fighting my own reputation, and looking back on it, I don't know why, but I would apply for jobs, and people would look at me and they'd say, with a resume like this, why do you want to work here? And I couldn't find a job anywhere. Nobody would hire me, and that made it even more tougher than it was. So we struggled during those years after the bankruptcy very, very hard with no income, and that made it very, very tough.